In this lab exercise, we're going to be completing forms. Okay, so we're going to create an HTML form that asks the user for the following: a name, a date of birth, email address, favorite day of the week using the select tags, and favorite fruit, allowing the user to choose from a list or enter their own. At the end of our form, we're going to include a button to reset the form fields and one to submit the form. Okay, the submit form button is not going to work because we're not actually submitting to a server or a database, but going to still include it, and our reset button is going to work. It's going to reset all of our input fields. Okay, so we want to start by creating our form tag. Okay, create our form tag, opening and closing. Great. So the first thing that we want is an input field for our name, right? So we're going to conclude, we're going to create an input element, and this input element is a self-closing element, so it doesn't have an ending tag. Okay, so we're going to set the type to be text. So we're going to use a type attribute and call it text. Great. And so our user would not know what to actually type in here, all right, because we don't have an indicator to let them to specify what we want inside of this input field. So for instance, what if I wanted a password or an email address or a phone number? My user doesn't know. And so we could use the placeholder attribute. Okay, we could use the placeholder attribute to actually set an indicator, a temporary text on what this input field should be. So I want this to be the name. You're going to see that it places some temporary text inside of our input field. And once I start typing, a temporary text disappears. When there's nothing in there, it goes back to that. Okay, so that's what the placeholder attribute does. So next, I want to create a date of birth. Okay, so I'm going to create a new input. And this time, I am going to set the type to be date. Okay, now that you see that this gives me a different placeholder, right? So once I click this calendar icon, it allows me to select a date, right? I also want to include a value attribute because when you're actually submitting this to a database, your database or your server needs to know what's the purpose of this input. And so I want this value to be date of birth. Okay, great. Now, we want an input field for our email address. Okay, so we're going to create a new input. This time, we're going to set the type attribute to be type email. Okay, now once it's set the text, it doesn't actually come with any sort of validation or indication, right? I can type whatever I want in there. But once I start typing in my type of email, my input email, it comes with a bit of validation. So here's what I mean. Let's say I type in an invalid email and I hover over. The browser is going to tell me, hey, please indicate an @ in the email address. JD Collins is missing an @ symbol. So if I include that @ watch what it says now. Please enter a part following @ JD Collins @ JD Collins @ is incomplete. Alright, so it comes with a bit of validation. Obviously it gets more validation in web development. It gets a bit more complicated. You would actually have to use JavaScript to get increased input validation. Okay, so we have an input for name, date of birth, and email. Next, we want to set, we want to create a select days of the week, right? So we want our user to choose from a predefined list of options, okay? And I'm going to show you, or I'm going to demonstrate the difference between the select and something we call a data list. So I'm going to create my select tags, right? Opening and closing. In between these tags, I'm going to create something called an option. Okay, an option tag, opening and closing. Now, in between these options, the first option is going to be our default selection. Okay, the first option is going to be our default selection. So I want this to say Sunday. You see that that is the first option, okay? I also want to say Monday. Okay, great. So I have all of my predefined options. And so you would notice that with the select, it only gives you a list of predefined options, right? I only can select from these options. I can't add anything. Okay, and that's going to be the difference between the select and the data list that I'm going to show you. And so I want to create a list of favorite fruits. Also, I'm going to allow the user to choose from a list of predefined options, but they're also going to enter their own, right? And we can do that by using the data list type, right? So we're going to create a data list, opening and closing. And this function is a bit different from my select type, right? Because inside of my data list, I also use the options, but these options, they're self-closing, okay? They're self-closing. Now I could say value, and this is how I get the actual name of my options to show up inside of my data list, right? So I could say, let's go with Apple. Okay, so we're gonna go with Apple, we're gonna go with pineapple, and we're gonna go with strawberry. Okay, so we have a predefined list of 3 different fruits. Okay, but you notice that nothing showed up on my web page. That is because in conjunction with the data list, we also need to add an input, right? This input doesn't actually, for the data list, this input doesn't take in a type attribute. It takes in something we call a list attribute, okay? A list attribute, and we're not gonna call this favorite fruit, favorite dash fruit. And we're gonna set a name attribute of fruit, okay? Now, even though our input showed up, our list still didn't show up, okay? Our list didn't show up, alright? So here's why. First, we set our list attribute. In the same list attribute that we give for our input, we want to set an ID attribute and give it that same name, right? So I'm going to set an ID on my data list. I'm going to set it to the same list name that I gave for my input, so favorite fruit, okay? And now we're going to see that our options actually show up now. But I could also submit my own favorite fruit. So maybe our user does not like apple, pineapple, or strawberry. Maybe they like mango, right? So with the data list, it allows the user to insert their own options. Okay. So next we want to add 2 buttons. Okay. We're gonna use the input element. We're gonna set a type of reset. Okay. We're gonna set a type of reset. And if we want to change that reset name inside of our button, we could set a value attribute. That's going to change the name. So I'm going to call this clear form instead. Clear form. Okay. And our submit button follows the same pattern. Input a type attribute. Type attribute is going to be submit. And if we want to change the submit value, we could say submit form. Okay. Great. Before we test our form, I actually want to break each of these inputs on a new line, right? So after each input, or after each element, I'm going to include a break tag. Okay, so the BR tag, it starts a new line after that element. Okay, so here we want to add a break. It's going to put email on a new line. I also want to break after email, so it's going to put my select list on a new line. Great. And after select, I want to put my data list on a new line. After data list, let's put both of my buttons on a new line. Okay, and we're going to leave them on the same line. So now let's test our form. So we're going to say let's select a date, right? Let's input an email, Saturday, let's say pineapple, and if we hit clear form, it's going to reset everything inside of our form, right? If I was to hit the submit button, it's going to say not found because we don't actually have this form set up to a server or a database. Okay, great. And so that is lab exercise form.